Hello, my name is David Stevenson.
And my name is Paul Quattrocasas.
And together we are the founders of Future Food Finance. This is the second of our podcasts where we aim to catch up for roughly 15 minutes each episode to have a quick run through what's happening in the food tech space and then do just a quick deep dive on a favourite subject. I'll cover public markets while Paul will ponder the state of private markets. And we'll both discuss the bigger picture and trends for investors in this fast expanding space. So let's start by going through some of the most interesting stories of the week. I'll quickly talk a bit about the markets. I've got a screen up in front of me. And the good news is actually that quite a few companies within the food tech sector actually saw their share price go up this week, which is great news. So, for instance, in no particular order, people like Blue Apron, Delivery Hero, Agronomics all saw kind of like 3 or 4% increases. But obviously there were some other companies that saw pretty big declines, particularly DoorDash, which was down about 10% on the week, and App Harvest, which actually I thought brought out reasonably decent numbers in their quarterly results, but whose shares got basically hammered on a down 11%. And of course, the biggest story here is that the markets are still in this kind of growth rotation phase. And I think we worked out on our index, which you go to Future Food Finance. In January, the index was down a rather unpleasant 18%. So obviously, the growth rotation is hitting the food tech sector quite bad. But just don't want to dwell on that. Two stories that caught my eye this week, actually. First of all, I saw that Walmart have put a big investment into Plenty. Plenty is probably one of the leading vertical farms, sustainable farming businesses. And for Walmart to put a lot of money into that business, we don't quite know the terms of the deal. The overall fundraising, we believe, was about 400 million. So we don't know exactly how much they put in and what the terms were. That's a really big vote of confidence. And Walmart have basically gone on record and saying that they're going to be having these vertical farms inside their supermarkets. And I think that could be a game changer. And then the other story I thought was interesting on the negative side is the Advertising Standards Authority here in the UK sort of came down a bit harsh on Oatly, which is the dairy milk alternative, because of an advertising campaign about whether or not, it's natural and healthy and all this kind of stuff. And that, of course, speaks to, I think, a wider story that's out there, which is that there are people who are pretty opposed to the rise of meat-based alternatives, be that cultured meat or be that plant-based alternatives or plant-based milk alternatives, and who don't like the language being used, and we'll come back to that later. Paul, any views just on those kind of hot subjects this week?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there, David. I will just comment first of all on the Walmart news, which is fascinating. Most people don't know this, but they generate over half their revenue from grocery supermarket, and like Ocado in the UK, they've invested in vertical farms. And Walmart is basically a tech company since they acquired Jet.com for $3.3 billion back in 2016. Walmart really is acting on every front across the value chain in tech. In fact, the same week they announced the Plenty investment, they also acquired 2 fintech companies for their new finance offering, which is going to be interesting to see. So expect more of that. Expect more investment into not just vertical farms, indoor farms, but also other, let's call it alternative protein solutions, and which we can talk about later. So I think that's extremely interesting and probably the right thing to be doing. Now, the comment on food tech share prices or the food tech, index price coming down, I think we should just qualify that to point out that the majority, or certainly the greatest proportion of constituents are delivery companies. So you have DoorDash, you've got Delivery Hero, you've got Deliveroo and Just Eat, and even HelloFresh. These delivery companies skyrocketed during the pandemic for obvious reasons. So they approximately doubled during the pandemic, and they've come back to earth, as one would expect, just like Zoom has. I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, where Zoom is back to where it was pre-pandemic as a stock in terms of its share price. So there's nothing surprising about any of that. And what's interesting is if you look at a company like Beyond Meat, which is not in delivery, although it does have a D2C, a direct-to-consumer offering, has also declined back to more or less its IPO price. However, in terms of what Beyond Meat has done as a company, it's much further progressed than where it was in 2019 in terms of number of food service operators who are selling the Beyond Meat product, the types of Beyond Meat products that are being sold, including chicken, its special formulation with KFC, which we talked about. So it's a general word of caution when it comes to investing, and maybe we can talk about this later when it comes to why the private markets are so interesting. General word of caution that timing is everything, as they say, and to be careful not to be caught up in the hype, but rather look at the fundamentals. Is what I will say.
Talking of fundamentals, I thought we could maybe do a bit of a deep dive on an interesting subject, which is cultured meat. I mean, what's your sense about the timescales for cultured meat? And we should say people have used other terms like lab meat and faux meat and all sorts of terms that are used. Obviously, the crucial thing is when it's likely to hit market. What's your say? Because mostly these are all private businesses, aren't they?
Yeah, well, it depends what jurisdiction, first of all. So Singapore has already approved chicken, and the company Just, JUST, is already selling cultured or lab chicken in Singapore. I would expect to see further approvals there over time in Singapore, perhaps earlier than any other country. The most interesting one is the U.S. And what is the time frame for the U.S.? And in the U.S., as I understand it, you need FDA and USDA approval. And so you can expect when it comes to the USDA, there are other issues beyond purely scientific or regulatory, maybe even lobbyists and unions and so on getting involved. I'm not an expert in that, but that's going to slow things down. It has slowed things down. When you look at, however, fish or the seafood element of cultured cell-based seafood, it's a little different because you don't require USDA, you just require the FDA approval. And so I expect that lab seafood will be approved earlier in the U.S., and I expect it'll happen this year. In fact,
as early as this year, do you reckon?
As early as this year. And that will be a game changer. And I know that the companies that are operating in this space are already lining up their distribution channels, as you'd expect, not just B2B traditional channels, but they're even asking, how can we go directly to the consumer? How can we go directly to certain restaurant chains or, delivery companies for something different? And so that's part of the excitement of food tech overall, is that these new technologies and technology, the ability to deliver food faster, like these ultra fast delivery services. If you're in London, you'll know Gorillas and Getir and GoPuff, certainly in the US, and Joker, and there's so many now. Well, they're enabled by technology in the same way that Uber has done the same with transport and taxis. And when you can deliver food in 2 or 3 years by robot and by drones, which we talked about before, it becomes even more interesting. And it allows for some of the cultured or lab-based meat to be produced locally. And I think that's the one comment I'd make about timing on lab meat is some companies that are claiming they can manufacture their lab meat locally. So in a smaller bioreactor, which is required for precision fermentation, if they can do it in the size of your refrigerator, then you can imagine all types of scenarios where that meat is manufactured much closer to where it's going to be consumed, as opposed to the slaughterhouse as we know it, where it's centralized with thousands of cattle and there's an entire production system, like producing automobiles almost. And that's all going to change.
I want to just come back to something though. There still seems to be a kind of a dichotomy or debate kicking around in the cultured meat sector. So the fish model. So we've talked to on Future Food Finance. We've talked to Blue Nalu, which is one of the big players in this space. And they're, I think, one of their earliest products, if not the earliest, will probably be, I think, redfin tuna. I always get it confused, but definitely tuna. Definitely tuna. And it's quite a niche product. It's quite expensive at the very beginning. If you buy the kind of tuna that they're talking about, properly caught, it is an expensive product anyway. So they're trying to replace an expensive product, and I see the logic of that. There's a lot of sense in that. Yeah. And yet, if you also talk to some of the enthusiasts for cultured meat, they go, and I'm probably in this category as well. they go, actually, it's no. The future's not in specialist products like that. The future is in replacing effectively input food, chicken, which you use in a sauce, or mincemeat that you use in a sauce, where the price point's incredibly different. One is very expensive, and I can see a niche market there, and one is going to have I think Jim Evans called it the griddle point. It's got to fight against not only natural meat, but it's also got to fight against plant-based meat as well. So plant-based meat, mincemeat. So one is effectively an upmarket strategy, very niche, very high value, and one is effectively a mass market strategy where price pretty much is 80% of it. Not everything, but it's a big. How do you see that? Because I'm not completely convinced that cultured meat will address the griddle point argument. I can see the higher margin bit. What's your take on that?
I think it's too early for any of this, frankly. Maybe not so much for seafood and fish for the reasons I described. And I think for meat, there was an article, David, as you and I, have talked about at length, that came out in the Counter magazine last year, called "Lab Meat is supposed to be inevitable, but here are the reasons why it's not." And it was supported by claims from work done by scientists, including former Pfizer pharmaceutical scientists and engineers, chemical engineers, and the like. And it made fairly strong claims that it was not possible to, from a economics perspective, cost perspective, to make mincemeat in vast volumes, because you needed to spend $450 million per facility to produce an amount of meat that, frankly, would be produced by slaughterhouse for much less cost by 2030. Now, there's all kinds of counterclaims that have been made by some of the companies to that since it came out. So right now it's still in a science. I call it a scientific gray zone where there's different opinions because it's too early. But like many other areas of life or industry where there are gray zones going out into the future, it's always a good idea to follow the money as a starting point to look at, well, what's the probability? Because it's all based on probabilities. What's the probability that this is going to happen? Or how is it going to happen? What's the probability that we're going to have niche offerings like steak or shrimp when it comes to seafood, or we're going to have mass market mincemeat and chicken produced? And if you follow the money, you look at the biggest amount of smart money so far that's gone into a few companies. One of them is Future Meat Technologies in Israel, which I commented on a few weeks ago. They raised, now in only 2.5-3 years, they've gone from startup out of a university lab to a major approximate $350 million fundraising in December. And the two major investors included Tyson Foods Ventures and Archer Daniel Midland, two of the biggest meat producers. Now, it's unlikely they would be putting at risk more than a few million into something that is still an experiment. Of course, it is all, until it's approved by the regulators, technically an experiment. But it's unlikely that they would be sinking significant millions of dollars into a company that is anything less than highly likely to be commercial and ultimately economically profitable.
So, Paul, just quickly, I kind of last 5 minutes, just two quick last questions. So probably, I think we're both saying seafood in next year, but I mean, I'm probably more cautious the next couple of years, but so not far away. But I'm guessing that probably both of us probably line up and suggest that for animal-based replacements, so effectively red meat and I think we are talking red meat because you said white meat with chicken's already been in Singapore. But red meat probably more than a few years away yet.
But let's also look at timing and investing versus trading. Trading is in and out every day, every week, month, whatever. When it comes to what this topic is all about, lab meat and cultured chicken, seafood, it's long term, and it's an interesting thing to be looking at now because the markets are fragile, they're volatile. The Bank of England, this ECB raising rates. The Fed is going to raise rates 5 or 6 times this year. The inflation worries. The public markets are weak, fragile. A lot of concern there. But if you're an investor for the long term, 3, 5, 10 years, then this is an interesting area to be looking at because there really shouldn't be much price fluctuation based on financial markets or interest rates. There is, but not to the degree that we're seeing transparently in the public market. So I think the safe assumption is it will take a long time, not just for the approval, but it's the production.
Yeah.
So I would suggest to those people interested in this area to look at the companies that are making the bioreactors, the fermentation tanks, who are engineering the precision fermentation on the chemical side, to really look at those things, because that's going to make the difference at the end of the day. For example, do the facilities need to be in a clean room or not? Does it need to be pharma grade, class A type of environment to protect against viruses or bacteria? Because these animal cell cultures are not like humans. They don't have an immune system. So these are problems or challenges that have to be solved. Now, science tends to solve most of these issues. The question is, how fast can science solve them? And are we going to see exponential increases in the problem-solving ability in these areas, just like we've seen in Moore's Law, or like we're seeing in solar and in so many other areas in technology? So I think that's the place to focus, is production and cost and ability to overcome some of the scientific concerns that are still in people's minds. So
the classic picks and shovels argument. One last question. Language. Actually, I think language is interesting, isn't it? I mean, the Good Food Institute, which is very influential in this space, has been arguing for using the word cultured meat. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We all know everybody used to use the term lab meat. Yeah. But that sort of doesn't really kind of conjure up much kind of rustic qualities. Let's put it that way around.
Yeah, I don't think it matters, David. I
was going to say, does it? Because the reason I mention it is because Oatly, of course, a lot of the dairy milk people have got in trouble because people go, well, it's not really milk, is it? Because milk comes from cows. Yeah. Do we think that the language matters?
Well, it depends to whom and for what purpose and when. So when you have a commercial product, it matters because for marketing purposes. Yeah. But in the case of the cultured meat and fish and so on, then it doesn't matter. I think, again, look to Singapore and what just is doing with, and I can't tell you that I have seen how they're calling that product in the restaurants where it's being sold and eaten. But I would look.
We haven't been able to travel anywhere recently.
Yeah, well, that's it, right? But that's where I would look first of all is, what are these products being called by the restaurant or by the grocery store? The very first few that are selling it, and it's probably not going to have anything lab or cultured or cell in it for sure, because that doesn't work from a marketing perspective.
Absolutely. Okay, right. I think we've run out of time. Paul, thanks. That's it for this week. Hopefully you've enjoyed this quick romp through and then a quick deep dive into the food tech sector. Do remember to look at the website, futurefoodfinance.com. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you.